I never thought I'd become the kind of person who photographs his own water meter every time he leaves town. But here I am, 53 years old, standing in my driveway every Sunday morning before I head to the airport, taking a picture of those little numbers like they're evidence in a case I haven't filed yet. I guess, in a way, they are. My name is Scott Harmon, and I'm a regional sales director for a medical equipment company based out of Nashville. I cover 8 states: Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, the Carolinas, Kentucky, and Virginia. Which sounds impressive until you realize what it actually means. I'm on a plane or in a rental car roughly 15 days out of every month, sometimes more. The job pays well, the miles accumulate, and my house sits empty more often than it doesn't. I bought the place 4 years ago after my divorce was finalized. 3-bedroom Craftsman in East Nashville, the kind of neighborhood that's been half gentrified, where you've got young couples with strollers on one side of the street and guys who've lived there for 40 years on the other. I liked that about it. It felt real. It felt like somewhere a person actually lived rather than somewhere a person displayed their lifestyle. After the divorce, I needed something that felt real. My ex-wife, we'd been together 11 years, used to say I treated our marriage like a layover. She wasn't entirely wrong. The road has always been easier for me than staying in one place. She moved back to Portland after we split. I stayed in Nashville because the territory made sense and because I didn't know where else to go. For 3 years, I traveled, came home, traveled again. My neighbor across the street, a retired postal worker named Harold, would wave from his porch when he saw my rental car pull up. The woman next door in her 70s had my number in case anything happened. I paid a local property maintenance company, Greenfield Home Services, to check on the place once a week. Make sure the pipes hadn't burst, the lawn wasn't embarrassing, the general impression from the street was that someone lived there. That was the arrangement. It worked fine until the spring of last year when my contractor called me about my water bill. I need to back up a little. His name was Paul Whitaker. He'd done some renovation work on my kitchen the previous fall, new countertops, replaced a section of the subfloor that had developed a soft spot, and we'd stayed in touch the way you do with a contractor you trust. He wasn't my property manager, but he knew the house, knew the neighborhood, and I'd given him a key during the renovation that I'd never thought to ask back for. That's important. I didn't think about it at the time. I was in Charlotte sitting in a Hampton Inn after a long day of hospital visits when Paul called. "Hey Scott, random question," he said. "You still out of town a lot?" I said, "Yeah, why?" "Had a job down your street this week. Your sprinkler system was running. I figured you'd have it on a timer or something, but it ran for like 4 hours straight in March." I told him I didn't have the sprinkler system scheduled to run in March. It wasn't even warm enough. There was a pause. "Okay, I'm probably wrong about this, but the light situation in your house seemed off too. Different rooms on at weird hours. I figured it was smart bulbs or something." I didn't have smart bulbs. I thanked him and hung up. I sat there for a moment, then I pulled up my utility account on my phone. I hadn't looked at it in a few months because it auto-pays and the amounts had always been consistent, $70, $80 a month for water, maybe $90 in summer. The bill for February was $260. January had been $210. I called Paul back. "Something's wrong at my house," I said. I want to be honest about what went through my mind in the hours after that call, because I think people assume that in a situation like this you get angry, and I did eventually. But first I was just confused in a way that felt almost embarrassing. I couldn't make sense of it. I live alone. I had no roommate, no girlfriend, no family member who might have had a reason to stay there. I'd been on the road for most of the past 6 weeks. I'd been in Charlotte, in Birmingham, and Raleigh. Nobody had my house key except Greenfield Home Services. And Paul, I reminded myself. Paul had a key. I didn't want to think that. Paul had done good work. He'd been straight with me. He was the one who called. But I thought it. I didn't go home immediately. I had 2 more days of appointments I couldn't cancel. A hospital system in Raleigh that had been on the fence about a major contract for months. I kept those meetings and I lay awake both nights running through explanations that didn't quite fit together. When I got back to Nashville, I didn't go straight to the house. I parked at a coffee shop 2 blocks away, the kind with the long communal tables and the cold brew on tap, and I sat there and thought about what I actually knew versus what I was assuming. High water bill, sprinklers running, lights on in wrong rooms. That was it. That was all I had. I drove past my house slowly. Everything looked normal from the street. The blinds were closed the way I always leave them. The mailbox wasn't overflowing. I went around the block and parked a few houses down and watched for maybe 20 minutes. Nothing. I let myself into the garage. I knew within 30 seconds that someone had been there. Not because anything was stolen. Nothing was. My TV was still mounted on the wall. My laptop was in my bag where I'd left it. My grandmother's silver was in the cabinet in the dining room. It wasn't a burglary. It was something else entirely. There was a coffee mug in the dish rack that wasn't mine. White with a small blue logo I didn't recognize. There were towels in the downstairs bathroom that were damp. Not old damp, the stiff kind of damp from a towel that dried 3 weeks ago. Fresh damp. Someone had showered in that bathroom recently, maybe that morning. I walked upstairs. In the guest bedroom, the bed was made, but not the way I'd left it. I strip guest beds after anyone uses them. The sheets were on, the pillow was fluffed. Someone had remade that bed. There was a phone charger on the nightstand, a short one, the braided kind, plugged into the wall. I hadn't put it there. In my bathroom, off the master, there was a second toothbrush in the holder. I tried to explain to people what that moment felt like, and the best I can do is this. It wasn't like finding out your car had been broken into, or even that your house had been robbed. It was more intimate than that. Someone had stood at my sink. Someone had looked in my mirror. Someone had decided that this house was comfortable enough to use, and had used it, quietly, while I was hundreds of miles away selling medical equipment to people I'd fly home and forget. I sat on the edge of my bed for a while. Then I called my lawyer. She told me the same thing the attorney I consulted 2 years prior told a friend of mine in a similar situation, that without clear evidence of what was happening, I was in murky territory. Breaking and entering requires proof of unauthorized entry, which is complicated when there's no sign of forced entry. She said I should document everything before I confronted anyone or changed the locks, because if this was what it looked like, I'd want a clean case. Document everything. Those 2 words were the only instruction I needed. The next morning I drove to a Best Buy in Green Hills and bought 3 indoor security cameras, a video doorbell, and an outdoor camera for the backyard. All wireless, all cloud-backed. I spent 3 hours installing them myself, moving quietly through my own house like I was the intruder, which is a strange feeling I don't recommend. I didn't change the locks. I wanted to know who and how many times. I needed to see it with my own eyes. Then I flew to Birmingham for a 3-day trip and I watched my house from a hotel room. The first alert came at 6:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. A man I didn't recognize walked up to my front door, typed something into the keypad. I have a keypad lock. The code hadn't changed since I bought the house, and let himself in. He was maybe 40, medium build, wearing a fleece vest and carrying a backpack. He moved through my entryway like he'd done it before, tossing his backpack on the couch in the living room, going straight to the kitchen. He opened my refrigerator. He took out a bottle of water. He sat down at my kitchen counter and opened the laptop. I watched this for about 10 minutes. My hands were doing something strange, a kind of vibrating stillness, if that makes sense. Not shaking, just not quite right. Over the next 4 days, I documented his routine. He arrived in the evenings, worked on his laptop at my kitchen counter, watched television in my living room, slept in the guest bedroom. He took long showers. He ran the dishwasher. He used the sprinkler system remote app, which, I realized, he must have found in the drawer in the utility closet where I kept it, to water the back lawn. He was not treating my house like a place he'd broken into. He was treating it like a rental. That thought came back to me on the 3rd day. He had a visitor on Friday afternoon, a woman, maybe late 30s, carrying a tote bag and a binder. They sat at my dining room table for almost 2 hours. At one point, she opened the binder, and I could see, on the exterior camera and installed in the backyard, that they were looking at printed documents, spreadsheets it looked like, columns of numbers. When she stood up to leave, I caught enough on the doorbell camera to see that she had a tablet open showing what looked like a review platform. I zoomed in. The color scheme was unmistakably Airbnb. I opened a browser and typed in my address. It took about 30 seconds. My house was listed as a stylish East Nashville home, walking distance to everything. The photos were professional, better than anything I'd ever taken of the place, and showed my living room, my kitchen, my guest bedroom, my backyard patio. The listing mentioned the thoughtful touches and well-stocked kitchen. Nightly rate $189. There were 11 reviews. Guests praised the comfortable bed, the convenient location, the very responsive host. I had to read that twice. Very responsive host. I had to read that twice. Very responsive host. Someone was running a short-term rental out of my house, collecting payments, communicating with guests, managing check-ins and check-ins and check-outs. And I had never once been contacted, consulted, or compensated. I'd been the unwitting landlord of a business I didn't know existed, funding the utilities and the mortgage while someone else pocketed the nightly rate. The total from the reviews, doing rough math on the nights mentioned, came to somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000. I barely slept that night. I spent the following day trying to figure out how. The man clearly had my door code. I'd never given it to a stranger. I'd given it to exactly 4 people: my ex-wife, who was in Portland and had no motive, my buddy from college who'd house sat once 2 years ago, Paul, my contractor, and Greenfield Home Services. Greenfield had the code. Greenfield also had a key to the lockbox on the back fence, where I kept a spare for emergencies. I pulled up Greenfield's website and looked at their staff page. The owner was a woman named Janet Marsh, who'd started the company 12 years ago. The page listed 4 employees. I looked at each photo carefully. On the second day of surveillance footage, a Greenfield employee had stopped by. I'd flagged it at the time as routine. They were supposed to check the property weekly, but I went back and watched more carefully now. The man on my doorbell camera that Tuesday was not the same man who'd come with the Greenfield van. But after the Greenfield van left, within about 40 minutes, the same man arrived, the man in the fleece vest, and let himself in using the code. The Greenfield employee had told him the code, or confirmed it, or the codes and schedules were accessible through Greenfield's system, and someone inside that system had shared them. I called my lawyer again. She told me to get everything in writing before I said anything to anyone. I spent the next 3 days watching, documenting, and building a file. On the 8th day, I got lucky. The woman came back. This time, she and the man in the fleece vest had a longer conversation in my kitchen. And this time, the camera audio was clear enough to catch fragments. She mentioned a name, Ridley, in reference to another property, talking about how Ridley's place in Germantown covers the gap weeks. She mentioned that they had 3 other houses in rotation. She said something about needing to be out of mind by the 22nd when the owner's back. I wasn't scheduled to be back until the 22nd, but I was already home, watching from a Holiday Inn 4 miles away. The man's name, I found him through what she'd called him casually, a last name Devon, was Devon Alcott. A quick search found him easily. LinkedIn, short-term rental consultant and property optimizer. Instagram, photos of renovated living rooms and 5-star ratings. He had a business name, something like Alcott Hospitality Group, and a website that was professional enough to look legitimate. The woman turned out to be his sister-in-law, who handled the listing management and guest communications. Her professional background was in marketing. The Greenfield connection took another day to unravel, but when it did, it unraveled cleanly. One of Greenfield's part-time employees, not a long-timer, someone brought on about 8 months earlier, had a profile on a freelance platform where he'd listed property access coordination as one of his services. When I dug into the account's connections, one of them was Devon Alcott's business page. I had my chain. I drove to the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department and asked to speak with someone in property crimes. The detective I was assigned was a methodical woman who listened to my entire account without interrupting, then asked to see the footage on my phone. She watched for about 10 minutes. "This is fraud," she said, not as a question. "Theft of services, unauthorized use of property, and depending on how they've been representing themselves to guests, potentially wire fraud because it's crossing state lines via the internet." She asked me how many other properties might be involved. I told her at least 3 that I'd heard mentioned directly. She said they'd need to look into whether other homeowners had filed complaints about unusual utility usage or unfamiliar activity. The sting took 11 days to set up. Detectives waited until both Devon and his sister-in-law were at my property for a scheduled meeting with an incoming guest, a couple from Chicago who had booked through Airbnb for a long weekend and had no idea what they'd walked into. The couple was mortified and completely cooperative. They paid $480 for 2 nights and shown up to what they genuinely believed was a licensed rental. When the officers knocked, Devin actually opened the door. He looked at the badges, then past them, and saw me standing on my own front walk. I don't know what I expected to feel in that moment. Satisfaction, maybe. Vindication. What I actually felt was tired. Profoundly, specifically tired, the way you feel when something that's been wrong for a long time is finally being acknowledged as wrong, and the acknowledgement doesn't undo any of the wrongness. Devin Alcott was charged with theft, fraud over $10,000, criminal trespass, and conspiracy. His sister-in-law faced charges related to her role in managing the fraudulent listings and collecting guest payments. The Greenfield employee, who had, it turned out, been feeding property access information to Devin for 9 months, across 5 different homes, was charged with breach of fiduciary duty and conspiracy. The trial happened 8 months later. I testified for about 2 hours, walking the jury through the surveillance footage, the documentation, the paper trail. Devin's attorney made the argument that the guests had received what they paid for, that no one had been physically harmed, that this was at worst a civil dispute. The judge was not moved. The jury was not moved. Devin received 3 years in state prison and 5 years of supervised probation. His sister-in-law received 18 months. The Greenfield employee who cooperated and testified against the other 2 received a suspended sentence and probation. All 3 were ordered to pay restitution to the 5 homeowners who'd been victimized. My portion covered the utility overage, the cost of the security system, the legal fees, and a portion of what a forensic accountant determined was my share of the rental income they'd collected. It didn't cover what it actually cost me, which is harder to put a number on. I want to tell you about the Airbnb piece, because it's the part people ask about most, and it's the part that still makes me the most frustrated. When I reported my listing to Airbnb, the response was swift in the worst way. The listing was taken down within 24 hours. Their fraud team reached out and was polite and professional and completely non-committal about what they were doing to prevent this from happening on their platform more broadly. They offered me a credit. I declined. I asked about their verification process for new listings, specifically how a listing for my home had gone live, gathered 11 reviews, and generated thousands of dollars in transactions without anyone confirming that the person listing it actually owned or had authorization to rent the property. The answer I eventually got, after several weeks of emails, was essentially the platform relies on hosts to represent themselves accurately. My property, my sanctuary, my mortgage, and the platform that profited from the fraudulent rental of it was relying on the honor system. I still think about the other 4 homeowners. One of them, a flight attendant based out of B&A who was gone 3 weeks out of 4, found out her house had been used when a guest left a review mentioning that the host had beautifully decorated the master bedroom. She'd never given anyone permission to be in that room. She told me later that she'd thrown away everything in it and repainted before she could sleep there again. Another victim, a contractor who traveled for projects, discovered that guests had been rummaging through his storage unit under the stairs. His financial documents, old tax returns, copies of past contracts, all accessible. He spent 18 months dealing with the fallout of what appeared to be partial identity compromise, credit applications in his name, an open store account at a retailer he'd never shopped at. When people think about rental fraud like this, they imagine it as a property crime, a financial crime, and it is both of those things. But it's also something harder to name. A sustained, deliberate intrusion into the private spaces where you are supposed to be safe, carried out by people who gambled that your absence made you a safe target. I sold my house 11 months after the arrests. I told myself I was selling because the neighborhood was up and coming, and the timing was right, and there's some truth in that. But the fuller truth is that I couldn't walk into my guest bathroom without seeing that toothbrush in the holder. I couldn't stand at my kitchen counter without picturing Devin Alcott working on his laptop while I ate breakfast. The house had been my sanctuary after a divorce that cost me a lot, and it had been taken from me not by someone who'd smashed a window in the night, but by someone who'd been methodical and patient and entirely willing to treat my private life as a business opportunity. I rent now in a building with a doorman and a key fob entry system. I have cameras in every room. My building management has standing instructions to call me if anything seems off, and I check those cameras more than I should, probably, but not more than feels necessary. Here's what I learned, and I want to be direct about it because I've talked to 4 other people this has happened to, and none of us knew any of this before it happened to us. Check your property on rental platforms right now before you finish reading this. Go to Airbnb and search your address. Then check VRBO. Then check Furnished Finder. If you travel for work, if you're away regularly, there are people who specifically target that predictability. They are not opportunists, they are organized, and they do research. Audit who has your door code. Every time a service provider gets it, treat that access as temporary. Change the code when the job is done. A locksmith will tell you this is excessive. Do it anyway. I had not changed my code in 3 years. Build a relationship with at least one neighbor who can tell you things. Not someone who might casually mention to the HOA that they've seen activity. Someone who will text you a photo at 10 p.m. as something seems off. Harold across the street. I've since given him my direct cell, not my email, not my Google Voice backup number. My cell. If something happens at my house, I want to know before anyone else does. Monitor your utilities, not obsessively but monthly. Set a threshold alert if your provider offers it. A spike in water or electricity is often the first sign that something is wrong, and it's a sign you can see from anywhere. Understand who has access through any company you hire. This is the one I wish I'd known before any of this happened. When you hire a property management or maintenance company, you are trusting not just the owner but every employee, every part-timer, every contractor they subcontract to. Do your due diligence on the company. Ask about their access policies. Consider a lockbox with a rotating code that you control rather than one the company controls. Finally, if you find evidence that something is wrong, document before you confront. I know that instinct is to change the locks and call someone and make it stop. But if you want prosecution, if you want these people to actually face consequences, you need evidence. Photographs, video footage, timestamps, a clear record of unauthorized access. 2 weeks of patience got me enough evidence to put 3 people in front of a judge. Walking straight into that house the first day would have gotten me a stranger who claimed he had permission and a case that went nowhere. I drove past my old house a few months ago. There's a young couple there now. They've repainted the front door a deep green, which looks good actually, better than the gray I'd chosen. There were bikes locked to the porch railing, a dog bowl by the front step. It looked the way it was supposed to look when I bought it. Like somewhere a person lives, not like somewhere a person passes through. I hope they never go looking at their utility bill and find a number that doesn't make sense. I hope they never stand in their own bathroom looking at a toothbrush that isn't theirs. I hope the door they come home to is always exactly the way they left it. But I also hope they've changed their door code. I hope they know their neighbors by name. I hope they've looked their address up on every rental platform available and found exactly nothing. Because the people who did this to me weren't unique. They weren't criminal masterminds. They were ordinary people who identified a gap, frequent absence, trusted access, no oversight, and exploited it systematically for months before anyone thought to look. Your absence is not invisible to the wrong person. It's an invitation. Protect your home like someone already knows your schedule, because they might. I've thought a lot about the specific chain of decisions that made all of this possible. Not Devin's decisions, mine. I gave Paul a key during a renovation and didn't ask for it back. I set a door code when I bought the house and never changed it. I hired Greenfield and trusted that their vetting process was thorough enough that I didn't need to think about it. I did all of these things not out of carelessness exactly, but out of a kind of quiet assumption that the systems I'd put in place were working the way they were supposed to. That assumption cost me significantly. Not just in money, though the number was real and it mattered. It cost me the house itself eventually. It cost me the feeling of safety in a space I'd built specifically to feel safe in. What I keep coming back to is this. Devin Alcott didn't find a vulnerability I'd hidden from myself. He found exactly the ones I'd left in plain sight. He looked for someone who traveled frequently, who trusted hired services without oversight, who hadn't changed their door code in 3 years. I fit every criterion. The operation wasn't sophisticated because Devin was particularly clever. It was sophisticated because I'd made it easy. There's something clarifying about that, even if it's uncomfortable, because it means the answer wasn't complicated either. It was documentation. It was patience. It was the decision to build a case rather than act on instinct and give him a way out. When I walked into that Best Buy and bought 3 cameras, I was doing the only thing that was actually going to matter, not confrontation, not rage, not calling Paul immediately to accuse him. Evidence. Methodical, boring, unglamorous evidence collected over 8 days from a hotel room 4 miles from my own house. I think about that choice a lot. The easy version of that story ends with me storming through my front door the day I found the damp towels. Devin says he had permission. I say he didn't. There's no footage, no documentation, no paper trail. The case goes nowhere. He finds another house. The Greenfield employee keeps feeding him information. 3 more families go through what my neighbors went through. The harder version is the one that actually happened. And what made it possible wasn't courage exactly. It was just the willingness to stay uncomfortable a little longer than I wanted to sit in a hotel room watching camera feeds instead of doing what every instinct told me to do. That restraint, that choice to document first, was the only reason 3 people ended up in front of a judge. I'm not telling this story because I think what I did was extraordinary. I'm telling it because I was completely ordinary when it happened to me, and the people who did it were counting on that. They were counting on my absence, my trust, my assumption that a locked door was enough. They built a business on the gap between how safe homeowners think they are and how safe they actually are. Paul called me about a water bill. He noticed something small because he knew my house and it didn't look right. That one phone call from someone paying attention started everything. I think about Harold across the street now, too. How many times he waved from his porch without knowing what was happening 20 feet from where he stood. The people who look out for us can only do it if we've told them specifically what to look for. That's the thing I'd want anyone to take from this. Not that the world is full of people like Devin Alcott, though it is, more than most of us want to believe. But that the people watching out for you are already there. Paul was there. Harold was there. I just hadn't been deliberate enough about letting them help. Your home is worth protecting like it matters. Because it does. And if something ever feels wrong, trust that feeling before you talk yourself out of it.